She signed a contract to save her mother's life. He offered a marriage to save his empire. What they never expected was to save each other. But love doesn't follow rules. And when past wounds rise, one lie could cost them everything. This isn't just business. This is the beginning of war inside the heart. Welcome, soul seekers, to Hearts of the Rich, where every luxury hides a secret and every fortune comes with a price. If you're hearing my voice right now, I believe you're meant to be here, because this isn't just a love story. It's a story about power, pain, betrayal, and the kind of redemption that leaves your soul trembling. So if you've ever believed that even the rich cry behind closed doors, subscribe to Hearts of the Rich and like this video right now to help others discover stories that matter for the heart, for healing, for the greater good. And tell me in the comments, are you watching all the way from the beginning? Type, I'm here from the start, if you feel this one already. Now, breathe in deep and let's begin. The windows of the 76th floor stretched across the sky like a cruel horizon. From his corner office in the Revel Tower, Dorian M. Viral watched the New York skyline in silence. Even now, with his empire on the brink of collapse and his name gritted between the teeth of board members like a curse, he stood unmoved, a storm in a Brioni suit. The divorce papers lay unsigned on the obsidian black desk, their presence more suffocating than the October fog outside. Across the page, the elegant handwriting of Ginevra Alder, his soon-to-be ex-wife, twisted like thorns. Her signature was flawless, polished, icy, like her. The betrayal hadn't been a tabloid scandal. Not yet, but it was something worse. Intimate, calculated. She hadn't just slept with someone else. She'd sold whispers of his company's internal strategy to a rival board in Milan, in exchange for a seat of her own. Revel Enterprises was bleeding, but the board didn't care about wounds. They cared about succession, stability, shareholder trust, and Ravel's own constitution, written by Dorian's late father in a time when legacy still meant marriage and heirs, demanded one humiliating thing. The CEO must be married, and not just a name, publicly, visibly, legally, which meant Dorian had 4 days left to find a solution, or he'd lose control of the company he'd spent 15 years building from the ground up. Not inherited, built from the shadows of grief and ambition, brick by ruthless brick. His assistant's voice broke the silence over the intercom. Mr. Viral, your legal counsel and HR lead are waiting in conference room C. Dorian didn't reply. He moved to the wet bar instead, poured 2 fingers of Glenfarclas scotch, 25-year, like the last year he'd known peace. His reflection in the crystal-mirrored walls looked back with exhaustion and control. Control. That's what this was about. When he finally turned and walked to the conference room, he didn't see the skyline. He saw the terms. He saw the loophole. And he saw the name at the top of the candidate list Marcus and Elise had quietly prepared. Calla Everin. Age, 26. Financial analyst. Dual degree in law and econometrics. Background spotless. No known connections to virile competitors. Recently bankrupt after her late father's biotech company collapsed in scandal. A man Dorian had once respected. She was everything the contract needed. Sharp, quiet, unknown. Desperate enough to say yes. Smart enough not to break. He tapped his pen once against the table, then gave a nod. Call her in and draw up the contract. Calla didn't know the car that picked her up would be bulletproof. She didn't know the man waiting at the top of the tower was watching her security footage as she entered the building, noting her unpolished heels and the cautious way she kept her coat buttoned high. She didn't know her resume had been reviewed by 2 ex-military cybersecurity experts before she even got the call. But what she did know was the sound of silence when your phone stops ringing with job offers, when the sympathy fades and the rumors take over. The girl whose father stole patents, the daughter of a fallen man, the whisper of scandal, too clean to be provable, too loud to be ignored. Still, Calla walked into that elevator like she was going to client pitch, not a life-altering negotiation. Her dark hair was pulled back in a single braid, her eyes too tired to pretend ambition anymore. But inside, something still flickered. Survival. Not greed. Not dreams. Just survival. And when she stepped into that conference room and saw Dorian Viral for the first time, eyes like winter, hands like weapons of gold, she didn't flinch. That's what made him pause. I appreciate you coming on such short notice, he said, voice low, rough from too many late nights. Calla gave a small nod. I was told it's a business offer. He gestured to the folder on the table. Marriage contract. 2 years. No physical obligations unless mutually agreed. You'll be compensated. Fully. Enough to pay your debts and start a life far away from all this when it's over. She opened the folder. The first number made her blink. It wasn't just compensation. It was escape. And then came the clause. Heir. Required. Within 24 months. She looked up, met his eyes. So, it's not just about appearances. It never is, he said quietly. Calla closed the folder. Her fingers were shaking, but her voice wasn't. Why me? Dorian tilted his head. Because you've lost everything. And people who've lost everything don't lie. The room stayed silent. And then Calla Everin said the words that would change both their lives forever. When do we start? The pen didn't shake when she signed. Calla's fingers moved with quiet precision. Initials on each page, signature on the last. Her heart thudded behind her ribs like a warning bell. But her expression remained calm. She was used to swallowing storms. Across the table, Dorian watched her with unreadable eyes. When she finally pushed the folder back toward him, he accepted it with the same cool control he used to handle billion-dollar mergers. But something in the air had changed. Not between a CEO and a desperate woman. Something more dangerous. An agreement between two wounded souls pretending not to bleed. You'll be moved into the penthouse tonight, he said, standing. Public announcement goes out in 48 hours. We marry this week. That soon? She asked, not surprised, but not ready either. Everything in my world moves fast, he replied, and breaks faster. She didn't ask what that meant. She already knew. The car that picked her up that night wasn't luxury. It was armor. Tinted windows, a silent driver in uniform, the kind of security detail that didn't announce itself. By the time she reached the virile penthouse, her life, the one she used to have, already felt like something distant, like a dream she'd forgotten mid-sleep. She stepped into the marble atrium, her heels clicking against polished floors that gleamed like glass. The space was massive but quiet, too quiet, like no one had truly lived here in a long time. The butler, a reserved man named Theo, showed her suite. Her things had already been brought in, except they weren't her things. The closet was filled with designer labels, curated in her size. Makeup she hadn't chosen. Fragrances she hadn't worn. The bed, dressed in fine linen, looked untouched. Like everything else in this building, expensive, beautiful, and cold. She sat on the edge of the mattress, exhaled slowly, and realized her hands were trembling. This wasn't fear. It was weight. The weight of a life she hadn't asked for, a name she hadn't earned, a role she was now bound to play. Mrs. Calaveral, a name that meant protection and pressure. She stayed up late that night, pacing the room in bare feet, her silk robe catching the firelight from the fireplace across the suite. The city pulsed below, distant and indifferent. She looked down at her ring, platinum, flawless, but too heavy for her hand. And she wondered, not for the first time, if she'd just made the worst decision of her life, or the beginning of something neither of them could undo. She didn't see Dorian again until the wedding. No dijerse, no desfitting. Everything was arranged without her input, yet perfectly tailored. On the morning of, she was ushered into a sun-drenched parlor overlooking the river. Stylists worked in silence. Elise, calm as always, handed her a flute of champagne she never touched. The dress, white silk, square neckline, subtle embroidery, fit like second skin. But she didn't feel like a bride. She felt like a pawn. A valuable one, but a pawn nonetheless. Downstairs, Dorian waited in a gray tailored suit that made the room seem smaller around him. He didn't speak as she entered. He only looked once, a flicker of something in his eyes, before stepping forward and offering his arm. The officiant spoke quickly. 2 witnesses signed. They exchanged vows without emotion. No kisses, no smiles. Congratulations, someone murmured. She heard the camera shutters before she registered the applause. By noon, she was legally his, and still completely alone. That night, she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows in her suite, untouched, still wearing the ring she hadn't removed since the ceremony. Dorian hadn't said a word to her after the car ride home. He'd retreated to his wing of the penthouse. Doors closed. Lights off. The silence pressed against her skin like frost. Until the knock came. Just once. Soft. Hesitant. She turned slowly. Opened the door. There he was. Dorian. Notie. Shirt unbuttoned at the collar. A quiet, uncertain shadow in the doorway. "I needed to see you," he said. Her throat tightened. "You're here." "I know I've been," he stopped. Swallowed hard. Distant. She didn't interrupt. He looked at her for a long moment, and then his voice dropped. "There are things I can't let go of. Things I don't know how to speak about. But this, whatever this is between us, it's not nothing." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then what is it?" "I don't know," he said. "But I want to find out." He didn't touch her, didn't move closer, but he stayed. And somehow, that meant more than any kiss. She nodded once, then turned and left the door open. The firelight flickered between them, and in the quiet, something began. The first storm of autumn hit Manhattan 3 days after the wedding. Rain pressed hard against the glass, tracing silver rivers down the windows of the penthouse. The city below blurred in streaks of light and thunder. Calla sat curled in the corner of the private library, her feet tucked under her on the velvet chaise, a book open but forgotten in her lap. The fireplace flickered low behind her, painting the room in amber shadows. It had been a strange week, a quiet one. No arguments, no romance, just two people orbiting each other like cautious moons, never colliding. Dorian left early, came home late. His presence was a scent, a jacket on the back of a chair, a scotch glass by the sink. But something had shifted since the wedding night, since that moment in the doorway where neither of them had stepped forward, yet neither of them had stepped back. She didn't know what it was, but it was there. That night, thunder rolled deep through the sky, the kind that made old windows shiver. She was still in the library, the book long abandoned, when she heard footsteps. Slow, hesitant, closer. He stepped in, no jacket, no tie, the cuffs of his shirt folded to his forearms. His hair was damp like he'd walked the last few blocks in the rain. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice softer than the storm. He didn't answer, just walked over to the wet bar and poured 2 glasses of scotch, one light, one strong. Then, without a word, he handed her the lighter one and sat in the chair across from her. She took it. Their fingers touched, barely, but it was enough. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the flames, like he was working up the courage to walk into them. "I need to ask you something," he said at last. She stayed still. "This air clause. The board is tightening around me. Some want to vote me out. Others are whispering that this marriage is a performance." "It was always a performance," she said, not bitter, just truthful. "I know," he replied, "but the curtain's coming down faster than I expected. And that means we either move or we fall." She looked at him then, really looked. His jaw clenched, but not in anger. His hands were steady, but his eyes, those sharp, unreadable eyes, weren't guarded. They were afraid. "Dorian," she said slowly, "what exactly are you asking me?" His throat moved once before he said it. "Are you ready? For that part of the contract." She didn't answer right away, just turned her eyes toward the fire. The rain outside made the silence feel heavier than walls. Then gently she spoke. "I've never been with anyone." He looked up. She didn't flinch. "I've never given myself to anyone, not because I was waiting for the right man, or because I thought it would be special. It's just never happened. I never trusted anyone enough to let them that close." The confession wasn't shy. It was strong, honest, stripped of performance. Dorian stared at her, and for the first time in years, his breath caught. Not because she was untouched, but because she was unguarded. In a world where everyone lied to him, postured, pretended, here she was open, simple, real. "I didn't come here to fall in love," she said, "but I didn't come to be a possession either. If this is about control or legacy or a box you need checked, then no. I'm not ready. Not like that." He set his drink down, walked slowly across the room, stopped in front of her, inches away, and crouched. His voice came low, hushed. "This isn't about control. Not anymore." He reached out, slowly, and took her hand. Not her waist, not her face, just her hand, like it was the only thing he dared touch. "You've given me more truth in 5 minutes than anyone has in 5 years, he said, "and I don't want to hurt that." She looked at him, blinking slowly. Her heart was louder than the storm. "So what now?" she whispered. He rose to his feet. "Now we wait, until it's something we want, not something we owe." Then he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him. Calla didn't move, not for a long time, because something had just changed, not in the contract, not in the boardroom, but in her heart. For the first time in years, someone had seen her and chosen patience, not power. And that, she realized, was more dangerous than desire. The gala was supposed to be routine, just another event to prove to the world and the board that their marriage wasn't just strategic ink on paper. Dorian had warned her the press would be watching closely. Every smile would be analyzed, every glance photographed. So Calla prepared herself. She wore a floor-length black gown that Elise had chosen. Understated but powerful, fitted like armor. Her hair was pulled back, makeup precise, expression calm. She looked every inch the wife of a billionaire. And yet, the moment they walked into the ballroom at the Halcyon Grand, she felt it. Something was off. Eyes lingered on her longer than usual. Smiles faltered too quickly. Conversations stopped the second she passed. Elise, usually poised and unreadable, wouldn't meet her gaze. She barely had time to wonder before her phone buzzed silently in her clutch. 3 messages. 1 link, all from anonymous sources. Her throat tightened as she tapped it open. Breaking, Dorian Viral's wife linked to her father's financial scandal. New documents leak evidence of hidden ties. Calla's fingers clenched around the phone. Every sound around her dulled. She turned to Dorian, standing tall beside her, unaware, until his phone buzzed too. He read it in one glance. His jaw locked. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward her. And in that instant, she saw it. Not rage. Not panic. Doubt. He said nothing. The ride home was wordless. He sat beside her in the back seat, staring out the rain-streaked window like the city held answers. She didn't try to defend herself. Not yet. Not when she still didn't know what the leak said, or who had planted it. But inside her chest, something was already breaking, because she knew that look. She'd seen it in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in eyes that were quick to judge and slow to believe. When they arrived at the penthouse, she followed him inside, trailing his silence all the way to the study. Finally, he turned. "Do you have any idea what this will do to our credibility?" he asked, low and clipped. She didn't answer immediately. "I didn't leak anything," she said. Her voice was steady, but the crack underneath, it was growing. He didn't move. "The board is already hostile. Now, they think I'm married into the same bloodline that nearly tanked their research division 3 years ago. You're the daughter of a man who cost this company millions. And I've paid that price," she snapped, eyes flaring. "I've lived in the shadow of his mistakes every day since. I buried my reputation to survive. And now I'm here, standing beside you, defending you, when you can't even give me the decency of asking if this story's true." He didn't answer. His silence said everything. She looked at him then, not as her husband, not as the man who had touched her hand in the library and promised patience, but as a stranger, just like all the others. "I never gave you a reason not to trust me," she whispered. "You never gave me a reason to," he replied coldly. Her breath caught, and with that, she turned and walked down the hall, her bare feet silent against the marble. Her heart beat anything but. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She locked the guest suite door behind her and stayed inside it for 2 days. No meets, no messages, no visites. The ring came off. The silence stayed. On the 3rd morning, she packed. 1 suitcase. Quiet, careful hands. The dress from the gala was folded and placed inside last. A final symbol of everything she thought they had started to build. She left the ring on the bathroom counter, and she walked away from the man she hadn't meant to love. But fate has cruel timing, because as she stepped into the elevator, Elise was racing into the building, her tablet in one hand and breath caught in her throat. "Calla, wait, please, you need to see this." Calla didn't stop. She barely looked. "I'm done," she said. "Whatever this is, it's his problem now." Elise blocked the elevator door from closing. "It's not him," she said breathlessly, shoving the screen toward her. "It's Ginevra, Dorian's ex-wife. She leaked the story. She forged everything. She planted the data to make it look like you were funneling shares to your father's old partners. It's all fake. The metadata traces back to her home server. We have it. It's over. She set you up to ruin your name and Dorian's." Calla's mouth opened, but no words came, because the one person who should have known her better than any headline, the one man who claimed he didn't want to hurt her, had believed the world over her. The pain hit slower than expected, like a wave you saw coming, but still couldn't escape. "I was innocent," she whispered. Elise nodded. "I know." Calla stepped back into the hallway, the elevator doors closing behind her, suitcase still in hand. "I need air," she said, and she walked into the rain. Not because she didn't want to stay, but because forgiveness doesn't come when the truth does. It only comes when someone is brave enough to ask for it. The penthouse was silent again, but this time it wasn't peaceful. Dorian stood in the center of the study, Elise's tablet still glowing in his hand, the damning truth staring back at him in cold blue light. Evidence, forgeries, server logs, everything undeniable. Ginevra had set Calais up, out of jealousy, out of spite, out of the need to remind him that no matter who wore the ring now, she still knew how to hit him where it hurt most. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was that he hadn't seen through it. He had doubted Calais. He, Dorian Viral, who prided himself on reading people, who built his empire by knowing when someone was bluffing, had looked her in the eye and turned away. He hadn't protected her. He hadn't even asked. His stomach twisted with shame. His chest felt hollow. He walked to the window, forehead against the cool glass, the city below flickering like it was mocking him. She was gone, not just out of the building, but out of reach. He'd felt it in her silence, in the way she hadn't fought him, hadn't screamed or defended or demanded. She just disappeared, like someone who had been burned before and didn't need another reminder of what it felt like. The same woman who had told him, with quiet grace, that she'd never let anyone that close. And he had proven why she shouldn't. He pressed the heel of his hand against his chest. It hurt, not the kind of pain he was used to, not boardroom losses or financial risk. This was worse. This was regret, raw and consuming. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he stayed at his desk, watching the rain streak down the windows, remembering every moment. Her quiet strength, her refusal to break, the honesty in her voice when she said she didn't want to be a possession, and how he had treated her like one anyway. At dawn, he picked up his phone. "Find her," he told Elise. "Whatever it takes. I don't care where she went." "Are you sure she wants to be found?" Elise asked softly. "I don't care what she wants," he said, then caught himself. Close his eyes. I care too much to leave it like this." It took 12 hours. She hadn't gone far. Just a small guest house upstate, quiet and tucked beneath golden trees, rented under a different name. Somewhere no one would think to look, because no one had ever cared to follow her before. When Dorian arrived, he didn't send his driver. He came alone. No suit, no armor, just rain in his hair and a truth on his shoulders that he couldn't outrun anymore. She was on the porch, sweater, mug in hand, eyes red but steady. She didn't flinch when she saw him, didn't rise, didn't speak. So he stepped closer, slowly, every word already trembling in his chest. "I failed you," he said. "There's no version of this where I don't admit that. I believe them. I let my past speak louder than your truth. And I'm sorry." She didn't answer, just looked out at the trees like they might tell her what to say. "I told myself I didn't want love. That marriage was strategy. That people lie. And then you came in, so still, so quiet, and gave me nothing but honesty. And I threw it away the second it got hard." He paused. "I deserve for you to hate me." Finally, she spoke. "I don't hate you." Those words cut sharper than anger. "I just don't trust you." And that was worse than rage. Because trust was what she had given him without asking. And he had broken it without blinking. He nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Then let me earn it," he said. "Not with contracts, not with control. Just let me try." A long silence passed between them. Then she stood, walked past him. Her shoulder brushed his arm. A flicker of warmth he hadn't felt since she left. She turned once at the door. "Trying starts with listening," she said, and walked inside, leaving the door slightly open. Not enough to invite him in, but not enough to lock him out. The boardroom was colder than usual. Glass walls, polished wood, the skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like a silent jury. 12 directors sat around the long obsidian table, their expressions carved from skepticism and greed. Ravel's quarterly performance report blinked from their tablets, but no one was really looking at numbers today. They were looking at Dorian, and they were waiting, because a vote was on the table, one that could strip him of everything. A no-confidence motion disguised as strategic leadership realignment. But Dorian wasn't fooled. They didn't want strategy. They wanted blood. All because he hadn't delivered the one thing they expected after the wedding. An heir. No child. No legacy. No proof that this marriage was real or sustainable. And then came the leak. The scandal. The headlines. Even with Ginevra exposed, even with Calais cleared, the damage had already stained their fragile trust. Dorian stood at the head of the table, hands flat on the surface. Not defensive, not begging, just grounded. I know what some of you came here to do, he said quietly. I've read the draft resolution, and I know you think you're protecting the company. I don't blame you. Murmurs. A rustle of shifting suits. But he didn't look at any of them. Instead, he exhaled, steadied his voice, and chose something he hadn't chosen in a long time. Truth. I built this company with my own hands, he said. No one handed it to me. I took the risk, made the sacrifices, buried more personal losses than any of you will ever see on a spreadsheet. But somewhere along the line, I started treating people like numbers too. Transactions. Assets. He paused. I did that to my wife. Now they looked up. Cala's name hadn't been spoken since the meeting began, but it hung in the air now, thick and raw. I married her because I had to. I stayed married because I wanted to. And when she needed me to believe her, I didn't. I failed her. Not as a CEO, as a man. He let the words breathe. No one interrupted. Dorian straightened. So, if the question on the table is whether I'm still fit to lead Ravel, he reached into his jacket. Then you'll need this. He placed a folded envelope on the table. His resignation. Signed. If you vote me out, he said, I won't fight it. I'll walk. But I won't keep pretending this marriage is a strategy anymore. Because it's not. He stepped back from the table and walked out. Just like that. No speeches. No last looks. Because the choice had already been made. He'd rather lose everything than lose her again. The rain had followed him home. The same storm that had kissed their windows the night she'd told him the truth. It was back now, weeping down the glass like the city remembered everything they tried to forget. He didn't know if the board would accept his resignation. He didn't care. He had spent his whole life calculating risk, controlling outcomes. But when it came to Cala, to the fire in her silence, the honesty in her pain, he didn't want to control anything anymore. He just wanted her a second chance. He found her in the same place she'd been when he arrived at the guest house. The porch. Same hug. Same quiet strength in her posture. I walked away from Ravel today, he said softly. She turned her head just a little. I told the board the truth. About us. About everything. She didn't speak. Didn't blink. He stepped closer. I couldn't protect you when it mattered. So now I'm protecting what matters most. Still, she said nothing. But her hands weren't trembling anymore. And when she finally looked at him, there was something different in her eyes. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of something warm. Something possible. That night, she didn't ask him to stay. She didn't invite him in. But she left the porch light on. And when he turned to go, she whispered, "Come back tomorrow." His breath caught. And for the first time in years, he smiled. Not like a CEO, but like a man who'd finally chosen something real. It was quiet when he returned. Not the uncomfortable silence they'd once shared, but something softer now. Warmer. The kind of quiet that invited breath instead of holding it. Cala opened the door before he knocked. She didn't say a word, just stepped aside and let him in, as if he'd always belonged there. The guest house smelled like cinnamon and books, like old wood and something fragile. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing golden light across the room. She wore a dark sweater, sleeves pushed up, hair tied loose at the nape of her neck. No makeup, no ornament, and yet she had never looked more powerful. He stepped inside, dripping from the rain, and looked at her like she was something rare. Something real. "You came back," she said. "You asked me to. Most men wouldn't. I'm not most men." "No," she whispered. "You're not." He took a slow breath. "I don't know how to do this the right way," he admitted. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "This," he said, motioning between them. "Apologies. Redemption. Love. I only know how to build companies. Not people. Not us." Cala walked toward him. Steady. Soft. "You don't have to know," she said. "You just have to choose." And he did. Right then. He reached for her hand. Not her waist. Not her lips. Just her hand. The same one he'd touched weeks ago in a cold library. The same hand he'd let go of far too easily. This time, he didn't let go. She moved closer until her forehead brushed his. Until their breaths aligned. Until the world outside disappeared. "I'm scared," she whispered. "So am I. I don't know how to be someone's forever. Then be mine tonight." Her eyes closed. And when she opened them again, she wasn't afraid. Because when he kissed her, finally, deeply, reverently, it wasn't possession. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't the air clause or the board or legacy. It was home. That night, they didn't rush. They didn't perform. They simply fell, like rain, like truth, like something inevitable. And for the first time in both their lives, They made love like people who had lost everything and still chose each other anyway. The morning after didn't come with regrets. It came with coffee, with quiet laughter, with fingers grazing skin beneath knit blankets, with eyes that held no masks, no defenses, no fear. Dorian looked at her across the sunlight pooling on the sheets and whispered something he never thought he'd say. "You changed me." Calla smiled, tracing her finger along his wrist. "No," she said. "You just finally stopped pretending you were unbreakable." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and knew, without question, he'd never let her go again. But love never comes without consequences, and the world they'd left behind wasn't finished with them yet. Because just when they thought they were free, a new secret was about to surface, one that would test them more than betrayal ever did. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks without press, without contracts, without shareholders or cameras or walls. The world had gone on outside the guest house, but Calla and Dorian hadn't moved. Not really. They cooked together. She burned the eggs. He learned how to make tea without asking. They argued over which side of the bed was colder and kissed without needing a reason. The man who once counted every second of his day now lost hours tracing the lines of her palm like a map he never wanted to stop exploring. And Calla, once so still, so guarded, laughed again. She didn't even realize how much she'd missed the sound until she heard herself do it in the kitchen one morning, flour dusting her forehead, Dorian trying and failing to beat egg whites into stiff peaks. "You can lead a global tech empire," she teased, "but you can't bake a cake?" He raised a brow. "I can hire 10 people who can." She grinned. "But you won't." "No," he said, pulling her close with batter-covered hands. "Because I like failing with you." Their lips met again, and the oven beeped, forgotten. The rest of the world felt miles away, until the phone call came. It was late when her cell rang. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something in her gut stirred. "Miss Everin," the voice asked. "This is Dr. Tully from Chelsea Wellness. You had some routine blood work done 2 weeks ago, post-gala physical clearance. Standard protocol for bored spouses." She frowned, sitting up on the edge of the bed. "Yes." There was a pause, a shuffle of papers. "We wanted to confirm some readings before contacting you, but at this point we're confident." "Confident about what?" "You're pregnant." The room spun. She didn't respond. Couldn't. "Miss Everin, I wasn't expecting." She cut herself off. "Thank you." She hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. Dorian was asleep in the next room. Or maybe not. She didn't move for 10 full minutes. Pregnant. 2 weeks ago. Which meant the night it finally stopped being pretend. The night they chose each other for real. That was the night everything changed again. Her fingers found her stomach instinctively. No bump. No sign. Just the weight of possibility. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. But she was something. Shaken. Awake. Alive. She didn't tell him right away. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she needed to trust herself first. The next morning, she looked at him across the breakfast table and wondered what kind of father he'd be. Would he leave his meetings early? Would he teach their child how to fix things with patience, not power? Would he still have that storm in his eyes when someone threatened their family? Would he hold her hand during the sonogram? Or flinch like his own father once had? She didn't know yet, but she wanted to, desperately. And that one terrified her, because it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about hope, a hope she hadn't dared carry in years. And now, it was growing inside her. That night, he found her on the porch again. Same chair, same mug, but something in her posture was different, like she was holding something fragile and sacred. "Everything okay?" he asked. She looked up at him, and then, without ceremony, without trembling, she placed his hand gently over her stomach. His eyes searched hers, confused, questioning, and then widening, realizing. She nodded once. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Until last night." He didn't speak. He didn't pull away. He just dropped to his knees in front of her, both hands now pressed to the place that carried their future. And for the first time in his life, Dorian Viral cried. Not for loss, but for something he never thought he could have. Family. Not legacy. Not performance. Real family. The calm didn't last. It never does. Not when you're married to a man like Dorian Viral. Not when the name you now carry is stitched into every column, every contract, every competitor's war plan. Calla had started to feel safe. Not naive, not blind, just hopeful. There were soft mornings now. his hand on her stomach before sunrise. His voice, low and reverent, whispering half-finished names and what-ifs against her skin. The baby had changed everything, not just between them, but within them. Dorian smiled now, not just in private. He held her hand during board meetings. He laughed when she teased him. His team didn't know what to make of it. Their cold-blooded CEO walking into the office with hope in his eyes. But love makes men vulnerable. And vulnerability, in the world of the rich, is blood in the water. The letter arrived by courier. A thick envelope, hand-delivered, no return address. Calla opened it at the kitchen table, unaware that it would detonate everything they'd worked so hard to rebuild. Inside, a lawsuit, filed under her maiden name, from Ginevra Alder. The claim? That Calla and Dorian's marriage was fraudulent, entered under false pretenses. But the contract they signed was proof it wasn't born of love, but necessity. That Dorian had violated the terms of their own divorce by marrying again so soon, and using marital assets to buy a new wife. Attached were documents Calla had never seen. Photos of the contract, the heir clause, her signature, the timeline. Ginevra had somehow gotten her hands on the original agreement, and now she was using it to invalidate their marriage. And worse, challenge custody of a child not yet born. Calla's heart raced as she read the closing paragraph. If the court deemed the marriage null, Ginevra could seize control of Dorian's remaining voting shares under the final, bitter clause of their divorce settlement. A clause Dorian had once called a dead relic of the past, but now it was back from the grave, and it could ruin everything. Dorian read the letter in silence, then folded it slowly, set it down on the table, and said nothing. Calla watched him, afraid of his quiet more than any rage. She had seen him furious before, cold, calculating, weaponized. But this was different. What does she want? She asked. He looked up. His voice was low. To humiliate me. Or punish you. No, he said. Not me. She felt it in her bones before he said it. She wants the baby, he finished. The silence that followed felt like ice cracking underfoot. Calla stood, both hands instinctively wrapped around her stomach. She can't do that. Dorian stood too, walked around the table, took her face gently in both hands. She won't. Then fight her. I will. His eyes burned, not with fear, but with something sharper. A promise. Whatever it takes, he said. I'll bury her case in the same grave she crawled out of. Calla gripped his wrists, her voice trembling. Even if it costs everything, he hesitated, and then nodded, especially if it does. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't care about the empire. He only cared about them. The courtroom didn't look like war. It was clean, modern, rows of polished benches, pale sunlight leaking through narrow windows. But Dorian knew better. This wasn't a hearing. It was a battlefield. Ginevra sat across from him in a navy suit, her lips pressed into that familiar smug curve, the one that used to make headlines but now only made Calla's stomach turn. Her lawyer was already posturing, waving copies of the marriage contract like a flag of dishonor. This union, he declared, was based on business, not love. The contractual clause for reproduction, the financial arrangements, all documented. My client contends that the marriage was fraudulent from inception, and as such, any resulting heir would fall under review in accordance with the Viral Alder legacy clause. Calla sat behind Dorian, hands resting protectively over the curve of her belly. He hadn't let her speak. Not in this. Not in the part where knives came wrapped in legalese. This was his burden now, his mistake, and his redemption. Dorian stood. He didn't look at Ginevra. He didn't look at the board representatives who had slithered in under the guise of concern. He looked at the judge, and for the first time in his life, he spoke without strategy. Only truth. Yes, the marriage began as a contract, he said, voice even. Yes, there was money involved, legal protections, even a clause requiring an heir. It was a performance. At first, the courtroom murmured. Ginevra's smirk grew. But performances end, he continued. And what happened after that wasn't fake. It wasn't bought. It wasn't planned. It was real. He turned then, not to the judge, to Calla. She looked at him like the wind had just left her lungs. I failed her once, he said, when I believed the world over her, when I let silence speak louder than trust. But I'm not that man anymore, because this woman didn't just become my wife. She became my compass. A beat. I would give up my company, my name, my future, just to keep her safe. And if that's what this court requires. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a single folder, and set it on the bench. Then here are my shares. Every last one. The room exploded. Board members shouted. Lawyers scrambled. Even Ginevra stood, face pale. Mr. Viral, this, her attorney started. I'm not done, Dorian said, calm as thunder. He faced the judge again. This is my statement. I release controlling interest of Ravel Enterprises. Effective immediately. All legal rights. All voting shares. Everything. Because no child of mine will grow up knowing they were fought over like stock options. Silence crashed down again. Except now it wasn't cold. It was reverent. Like everyone in the room had just remembered what it meant to stand for something. Calla stood slowly, her hand to her mouth. Tears on her cheeks. But not of fear. Of awe. Of love. Dorian walked to her, ignoring the chaos behind him. He dropped to one knee. Not for show. Not for forgiveness. But for her. For as long as you'll let me, he said softly. I choose you. Not for the board. Not for the contract. Not for the company. Just you. She reached down, fingers shaking, and cupped his face. And whispered, I never stopped choosing you. They left the courthouse hand in hand. No press statement. No headlines. Just peace. And a future no one could buy. Because they'd already paid for it. With truth. With fire. With love. The sky was pink when it happened. A quiet sunrise over the Hudson, streaked with clouds the color of faded roses. The city was just beginning to stir, unaware that in one sun-drenched delivery room above it all, everything was about to change. Calla's grip crushed Dorian's hand. He didn't flinch. He stayed right there, forehead against hers, heart in his throat, whispering her name like a prayer. You're okay, he breathed. I've got you. I'm here. The contractions had started just before dawn. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't panicked. She just looked at him and said, it's time. And for the first time since he'd held $1 million acquisition in his 20s, Dorian Viral froze. Not out of fear, out of awe. Now, hours later, her breath came in broken waves. Her skin damp, her body trembling. But her eyes? Steady, locked on his. Push again, Calla, the doctor said. You're almost there. And then it happened. A cry. Sharp. Alive. Calla gasped. Dorian forgot how to breathe. They placed a baby on her chest, tiny, red, perfect. A boy. A son. She sobbed, laughing and shaking all at once. Fingers tracing the newborn's cheek like she couldn't believe he was real. Dorian didn't move at first. He just stared, because for a man who once thought he'd never want children, he had never wanted anything more. The nurse nudged him gently. Do you want to hold him, Mr. Viral? He nodded once, took his son in his arms, and broke, not loudly. Just tears, silent, steady, falling down his face as he stared at the proof of everything he thought he wasn't worthy of. Calla reached up, brushing his jaw with her thumb. You're already everything he needs, she whispered. He kissed her forehead. No, he said. You are. 2 days later, a package arrived. No return address. Inside, a letter. The handwriting, unmistakable. His father's. The letter had been dated over a decade earlier. Sealed and delivered per a clause in the Ravel estate plan, to be opened by my son upon the birth of his first child. Dorian sat on the edge of the hospital bed, Calla curled beside him, baby asleep in her arms, as he read. Dorian, if you're reading this, then you've done what I never had the courage to build a family, not just a fortune. I spent my whole life protecting a legacy, and somewhere along the way, I forgot that love is the only legacy that matters. If you become a father, I pray you'll do better than I did. Don't teach your child how to win. Teach them how to feel, how to fall and rise and fight for something real. And if you found someone to build that with, don't let the world harden you. Let love soften you. It was always meant to. Dorian folded the letter slowly, laid it on a nightstand beside the sleeping child, then turned to the woman who had turned his empire into a home. I want to rewrite the Ravel Constitution, he said. Calla blinked. Why? Because marriage shouldn't be a requirement for power, he whispered, and love shouldn't be measured in contracts. She reached for his hand. I think your father would be proud. He looked down at their son. I think I'm proud, he said. For the first time, I think I'm proud of the man I've become. That night, the lights of the city blinked in silence as a new life dreamed in his crib. And two souls, once strangers, once fractured, found sleep in each other's arms. Not because they had to, but because they finally understood what it meant to choose love. Again and again. The room was full of laughter. Not the polished, rehearsed kind that echoed through boardrooms or charity balls, but the messy, unrehearsed kind. Baby giggles, the clatter of a wooden toy on hardwood, the soft hum of coffee brewing. Sunlight streamed through the penthouse windows, flooding the once sterile space with life. There were photographs on the walls now. A black and white picture of Calla holding the baby, forehead pressed to his. Another, Dorian asleep on the couch, infant sprawled across his chest, both of them breathing in the same quiet rhythm. The house didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt like home. Calla stood barefoot in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal, humming something old and gentle. Dorian leaned against the doorway, watching her like he still couldn't quite believe this life was his. He held a folder in one hand. "Guess what I signed this morning?" he said. She turned, raising a brow. "The new security protocol?" "Nope." He crossed the room and handed her the folder. She opened it, scanned, froze. "Dorian, this is the Revel Charter." He nodded. "And this," she pointed to the highlighted section, eyes wide, "you changed the inheritance clause." "I rewrote the entire policy," he said. "No more forced marriages. No more bloodline clauses. Anyone who earns their seat at the table gets it." She looked up, stunned. "And this clause?" she whispered, voice catching. He smiled. "Love is not a liability. That one's yours." She set the folder down and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest. "You're rewriting more than policy," she said. "I know," he whispered, holding her tighter. "I'm rewriting myself." That afternoon, they held a small ceremony on the rooftop garden. Just them, the baby, a minister who'd been Calla's neighbor growing up. No press, no headlines, no contracts. They stood barefoot beneath white string lights, flowers in her hair, wind tugging at the corners of Dorian's linen shirt. The city stretched behind them, vast, uncaring. But none of that mattered anymore. Not power, not legacy, just the woman in front of him. And the vow he wanted to say, for real this time. "I married you once to save my company," he said. "But today, I choose you without conditions, without clauses, without strategy." Calla's eyes glistened. "I married you because I needed safety," she whispered. "But today, I choose you because you've become my shelter." He took her hands. "I vow to never doubt you again, to listen, to fail, but never walk away." She smiled through tears. "And I vow to remind you, when you forget, that you were always more than the empire." The minister smiled softly. "Then by the power of choice and love, I now pronounce you partners in everything that matters." They kissed. Their sun clapped. And somewhere far below, the city kept moving. But up here, time stood still. And just like that, what began as a contract became a vow, rewritten with love. Thank you so much for watching. If this story touched you, even just a little, don't let it be the last one. Subscribe to Hearts of the Rich and tap the like button so more hearts can find stories like this. And if you're still feeling something deep in your chest, you're not alone. Go now to the Hearts of the Rich playlist, where every story is a journey through betrayal, redemption, and love that never comes easy, but always finds its way home. Until next time, take care of your heart. We'll see you in the next story.